Um, I'll just take a moment to say welcome again, everybody. This is the breakout session with the presentation provided in English. And Chad introduced me earlier. My name is Morgan. I work as the Interim Director of Policy and Research at CURT. So I'll be walking you through the English presentation today. And today we're here to talk about the employment situation of English-speaking Quebecers in Capitale-Nationale in particular. This is, I would say, the bread and butter of what we do. It's really important for us as an evidence-based organization to understand what specifically is going on in different communities across Quebec in order to develop our research to look at specific issues and to inform the advocacy that we do. Now, to answer the question, what is the employment situation of English speakers in Capitale-Nationale? If we want to answer that with hard data, the only source available to us is the Census of Canada. So this is the only source that collects socioeconomic data that can be sorted according to language. And the large limit of this, of course, is that the census is only conducted every 5 years. And the most recent census, 2021, looked at 2021 and 2020, which, as we recall, or perhaps have repressed, was a pandemic year. So that is a factor that affects the data that we're going to see today. So to supplement this data, we at PERT rely on qualitative data as well that we collect through focus groups, interviews, community surveys. And this also helps to provide context for some of the figures that we see in the hard data. For this particular data set, we conducted focus groups with stakeholders in the Capitale-Nationale area, working with, representing, or serving English speakers. And so we'll touch on that a little bit later in the presentation. Now, the big question, how do we understand individuals according to language? In this profile, we count English speakers and French speakers according to Statistics Canada's definition of first official language spoken, which takes into account a couple different ways of measuring linguistic identity, so mother tongue, language used most often at home, and knowledge of official languages. And we use this definition because we consider it to be the most inclusive and practical definition. It gives a realistic count of the number of individuals likely to seek English language services or who might require other language-specific services like French language training. So now we'll dive in. So I'm going to present an overview of the population linguistically in Capitale-Nationale, and then we'll go into some of the more employment and economic stats. And for me, this is the interesting stuff. This is the nitty gritty. But again, if you need any questions or would like clarifications on anything you're seeing, please stop me. So what we're seeing here is a graph of the region of Capitale-Nationale compared to Quebec, and just broken down by language. So we see in Capitale-Nationale, just over 2% of the population are English speakers, whereas at the provincial level, about 15% of the population are English speakers. If we break it down by MRC level, we see that this is quite consistent throughout. La Jacques-Cartier is the MRC with the largest proportion of English speakers at about 30.1%. However, if we're looking at raw numbers, Quebec City has the largest sheer number of English speakers, which perhaps isn't a surprise as it's generally the most populous MRC in the region. And this chart is going to give us a breakdown of linguistic population according to different demographic features. So of the total population in Quebec, how much do, on the left column, English-speaking men, women, youth, mature workers, etc., make up compared to French speakers? So you can see generally about half of the English-speaking population are men, half are women, small minorities are youth and mature workers, and slightly larger shares are visible minority and immigrant populations. Those are a brief overview of the population. For those of you who are interested in seeing some of these statistics in more depth, so perhaps understanding the demographic breakdowns by MRC, that data will be available in our full report, or you can spend a lot more time with it if that's of interest to you. But for now, we'll turn to the labor force. So the labor force comprises all individuals who are either working, they're actively employed, or they're unemployed, but they're interested in working. So they've been actively looking or have concrete plans to start working at the time that the census was administered. So what we're seeing here are graphs, English on the left, French speakers on the right, showing the proportion of the labor force made up in each MRC by each linguistic community as compared to their weight in the total population. So what I'll draw your attention to here is we can see that largely speaking, English speakers tend to occupy a slightly higher proportion of the labor force than they do of the total population. But this is generally by 0.1 of a percentage point or so. And then this is similar information, but just the raw numbers. So how many people, English versus French speakers, are actively in the labor force? We'll see again, the largest share is in Quebec City, which perhaps isn't, again, a surprise as the largest MRC in the region, followed by La Jacques-Cartier. So now we'll look at labor force participation. So this is out of the entire population, aged 15 plus, how many individuals are in the labor force, so actively employed or unemployed but seeking employment. An example of somebody who wouldn't be in the labor force would be, say, a student studying full-time or a retiree. So in Capitale-Nationale, as in Quebec, English speakers tend to have a slightly higher labor force participation rate as compared to French speakers. And this has some variance across the MRCs in the region. So you'll see, according to this graph, essentially the latter half in Quebec City and in Pont-Neuf, English speakers do have a higher labor force participation as compared to French speakers. In the other RMCs, the exception of Charlevoix-Est, we see English speakers have a slightly lower labor force participation than French speakers. In Jacques-Cartier in particular, we see that French speakers have a significantly high rate of labor force participation, and that is perhaps part of the disparity that we're seeing there. I'll also just note that Charlevoix and L'Île d'Orléans have smaller English-speaking communities, and for this reason, sometimes the statistics aren't representative or they're drawing from a small group. I see a question. Yes, please jump in.
Yeah, one question. What is the difference between Quebec and Capitale-Nationale here? Because we have the province, but then you have Quebec and Capitale-Nationale. Don't...
Yeah, thank you. Great clarification. So Quebec here is Quebec City, agglomeration of Quebec City. So that MRC in particular.
But and then Capitale-Nationale?
Capitale-Nationale is the region as a whole. So essentially the sum of all the previous bars that you see.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for the clarification. That's helpful. This Capitale-Nationale and the Laurentide are two regions where there are MRCs that have similar names to the region or to the province, which absolutely can.
One suggestion, maybe just for showing data, if you will, like, because it's a mix up, but don't. I will add Capitale-Nationale. Then it's all of them, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now I got it. But,
and I'll no problem. I'll flag that out throughout the presentation to keep that clear. So now here again, looking at the region as a whole, we can look at the labor force participation rates according to, once again, different kind of demographics. So some things that I'll point out, men across the board tend to have higher labor force participation rates than women. We see this in both linguistic communities. So English-speaking men have a higher labor force participation rate than English-speaking women. And the same is true in the French side of things as well. However, on the whole, English-speaking men have the highest labor force participation. I'll also flag that visible minority and immigrant groups tend to have higher labor force participation rates as well. And again, this is true in both linguistic communities. And then the final thing that I'll just flag here is that if we look at youth, we see that English-speaking youth have a significantly lower labor force participation rate by about 11, I'm doing my quick math here, 11.5 percentage points as compared to French speakers. So that's a significant gap that we see in the youth demographic in particular. So now I'll pivot us towards top industries. So this tells us a little bit about where English speakers in the region are, in the region are working. So this is a breakdown according to each of the MRCs. So you'll see the main industries for English speakers vary pretty significantly according to MIC. I'll maybe just tease out in a couple different areas, Capitale-Nationale, for example, or sorry, Quebec City. I don't want to confuse myself or you. In Quebec City, professional, scientific, and technical services is the leading industry for English speakers, followed by public administration. In the Jacques Cartier, public administration is the leading industry by a significant percentage, but 35% of all English speakers in that MRC are employed in public administration. In Pont-Neuf, it's manufacturing, and this is true in Côte-de-Beaupré, Charleroi aussi. And then this is similar information, but presented for the region as a whole. So as we saw in the previous slide, public administration is a large industry in the region, generally speaking, as the seat of the provincial legislature. And that's true for English speakers as well. About 14% of all English speakers in the region work in public administration, followed by 12.8% in professional, scientific, and technical services, and then 12.1% in education. So you can see that there's a lot of engagement in service-oriented industries or tertiary industries. And this is also true largely among French-speaking communities in the region as well, but there is some shifts. So we see that the top industry among French speakers in the region is healthcare, employing 15.3% of all French speakers, followed by public administration and then retail trade. And I'll pivot to look at unemployment. So in Capitale-Nationale, as in the majority of regions in Quebec, English speakers have a higher unemployment rate than French speakers. At the regional or at the provincial level, we see an unemployment gap of 4 percentage points between English and French speakers. In Capitale-Nationale, it's slightly lower at 2.3%, although that's still a significant gap. And this information gives us, or this graph gives us more information about the employment rates within specific MRCs. So I understand that in Charleroi, again, the number looks quite high. I'll just flag that this is because it's a small community. So if you have something like 30 individuals and 10 are unemployed, that can result in a very high unemployment rate, although that isn't necessarily representative. In Quebec City, we see the highest unemployment rate in the region for English speakers or for any group aside from Charleroi at 9.4%. And again, we see that English speakers tend to have higher unemployment rates than French speakers across the region. So who are these individuals? So there are about 938, just under 1,000 English speakers in the region who are unemployed as of the census when it was administered in May 2021. So we will flag that this can fluctuate, but unfortunately, we don't have new linguistic data on this point until the new census is released in 2027 or 2028. But within this population, we see that it's approximately half men and half women, although a higher proportion of men, slightly higher proportion of men. So within this 938 group, about 54% were men. About 1/3 identified as immigrants, 34.1%. Similarly, a third, excuse me for the text there, are visible minorities at about 36.3%. And more than a half had attained a post-secondary level of education, 63.3%. So that means that approximately 2/3 of all unemployed English speakers in the region do have either a CEGEP or a university degree. And the majority had worked part-time before they were unemployed, so about 60.8%. And here we'll look at the unemployment rates by, again, demographic breakdown, so the same format as table that we saw for labor force and total population. So we see that Demographically, among English speakers, women have a higher unemployment rate than, sorry, among English speakers, women have a higher unemployment rate as compared to men. This is also true among French speakers, but the gap is narrower within that linguistic community. Youth across the board tend to have a higher unemployment rate. This is true for English speakers and French speakers. However, English speaking youth have a significantly higher unemployment rate at 14.3%. And then finally, we see visible minority English speakers have approximately the same rate of unemployment as the total population of English speakers. But among French speakers, the unemployment rate for visible minorities is a little bit higher, so roughly on par with English speakers. And Indigenous English speakers as well. And on the French side, Indigenous French speakers have higher rates of unemployment. So now I'll move us on to income. So we've gone from kind of the employment side of things to paint that portrait, and now we'll look at income. And what we'll see here to preview our findings, to scoop myself, is that the disparities that we see in unemployment that often see English speakers faring worse also exist when we're looking at the economic side of things. So we look at median employment income because we're an organization that focuses primarily on employment. So again, we see a similar gap at the provincial level as at the regional level. So English speakers make about $5,000 less as compared to French speakers within Capitale-Nationale in median employment income. And then if we break that down by MRC, I recognize it's a lot to look at, but we see some fluctuation in the income disparities. But in Quebec City, where we have the largest concentration of English speakers by number, we do see that again, English speakers earn a significantly lower median employment income as compared to French speakers by about $8,000. For this graph title. So what we're looking at here, the median employment incomes from English and French speakers. This is again the same data presented in a table. Again, I'll flag that we tend to see men earning higher incomes, and this is true in both linguistic communities, although men in the French-speaking communities tend to earn on top of that a higher income. Yes, I see a question.
Yes, just as a refresher, what's considered an English speaker again?
Yes, absolutely. So these would be, we use Statistics Canada's first official language spoken definition. So this is a methodology that looks at first official knowledge of English as compared to French, mother tongue, and language spoken most often at home. So generally it's people who identify English over French as the language in which they are most comfortable expressing themselves.
Okay, so there's no distinction between unilingual and bilingual.
Not in this particular data, although I can let you know that is preparing a report that does look at unilingual and bilingual French and English speakers to drill down further in that data set. I'm actually authoring that report right now.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem. We will see some overarching just bilingual data available at the end, although it doesn't look at income as per linguistic proficiency. All right, so again, what we see in this data is that some of the disparities that we flagged earlier persist in income as well. So youth, for example, earn a lower median employment income across the board. This can often be expected, or this is standard because youth tend to be perhaps in early career or working part-time or working in industries that have lower remuneration. Yes, I see two hands. Or perhaps Carol, you still have your hand raised, but I see one other.
Sorry, my name is Gabriela.
Yes.
I sent a text, but I'm so lost. Like, honestly, I got invited to this meeting and because I was looking for a job, and then like I don't understand the meeting point. Like, I don't know what we're doing. I don't know why we're looking at these numbers. What is this
Gabriela?
about? Yes.
Gabriela, I'm gonna drop my email in the chat. And then
Okay.
you can leave the call because I don't think this is particularly for you. That's okay. But before you do, I'll drop my email in the chat and I'll be able to kind of connect you with maybe another organization or some information that we might be able to help you gain employment. Is that okay?
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
No
Thank
problem
you so
at all.
much for
Just give me 1
clarifying.
second.
Any questions before we move on? Any other questions, I should say. All right. Just to summarize quickly, then, what we see is, again, disparities in income across between English and French speakers. And these also are kind of affected among different demographic groups as well. Oh, Adrian, yes, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, Morgan. Thanks. My question is just, I forget how I answered the census. Is it when we're collecting information about income, do people answer from a range? Because if they did, I don't know how we would get such precise numbers. I guess they're answering their exact income at the time of the census.
Yeah, I will clarify that for you after this presentation. I have an answer. I just have to remind myself of the definition. But these figures are medians, so that's why you would see kind of the rounding figures, but they're still kind of quite specific numbers.
Right. Okay. Because I think you probably answer it in a range. It must be that way.
It would
Anyways,
be that, or I'll find out. I'll confirm for you after the call.
thank you.
No problem. Any other questions on income? All right, so I'll move us ahead then.
Sorry, Morgan, just to make sure,
Oh.
Gabriella, I've just messaged you directly, just making sure.
Thank you, Carol. And Ruby, I see you have your hand up as well.
Yes, sorry. Could you go back to the one previous slide, please?
Absolutely, here you are.
Okay, what should be at the top of there instead of the words unemployment?
Yeah, sorry, that should be median employment income. I'll send you we'll make sure you guys have the updated information, but it's median employment income.
Okay, and
Apologies for the
audio was playing up a little earlier and I didn't quite follow the answer that you gave Lorraine about teasing out bilingual versus unilingual Anglos. Could you just be so kind as to summarize that real quick?
Yes, absolutely. So this report doesn't focus heavily on the difference between bilingual and unilingual English or French speakers. At the end, we will present data on bilingualism rates, but we do have a full report coming out hopefully in the winter, although please don't hold me to that, that looks specifically at the outcomes of English and French speakers according to their linguistic proficiency. So English speakers who are quote unquote unilingual or only speak English as compared to bilingual English speakers and then unilingual French speakers and bilingual French speakers. So that data is forthcoming, but not addressed in this particular profile. Does that does that help to clarify?
It does help. Thank you so much, Morgan.
Wonderful. It's my pleasure. All right, so I'll move us along to look at low income data. So this is a proportion of individuals who are living at or below the low income cutoff. So we don't have data available for several of the MRCs for English speakers, again, owing to low populations in those areas. But where we do have data where there are larger concentrations of English speakers, we see that a significantly higher proportion of English speakers as compared to French speakers, almost double the proportion, are living below the low income cutoff. So this tells us a lot about kind of the types of support or intervention some of these English speakers might benefit from. And this disparity is actually wider within this region as opposed to within the province as a whole. So finally, I'll shift us just to look at work activity. So these are some of the surrounding kind of work profiles of English and French speakers. So here we're looking at data for individuals who worked part-time as compared to full-time. So at the provincial level, we see generally about a 50-50 split among English speakers, but in the French side of things, we see that French speakers have a slightly higher engagement in full-time work as compared to part-time work. In Capitale-Nationale, we see that the region mimics the province in that respect. at least for English speakers, although among French speakers, there's a slightly higher engagement in full-time as compared to part-time work. This graph looks at the average number of weeks worked. So in Capitale-Nationale, as a region, similar to the province as a whole, we see that English speakers work slightly fewer weeks on average per year as compared to French speakers. So again, this likely reflects a higher engagement in part-time work or seasonal work. So things like construction, tourism, not in this region necessarily, but in other regions, fishing, those kinds of things that are perhaps oriented in the summer. And now we'll look at education. So the education data for this region in particular, I think is really interesting. So we see in this graph, the percentage of English speakers in red who have a post-secondary certificate, degree, or diploma. In pink, individuals with a high school level education, and in gray, with no formal education qualifications. So Quebec, Capitale-Nationale, apologies, has one of the highest rates of post-secondary educational attainment in the province. So 70.2% of all English speakers in Capitale-Nationale have a post-secondary education as compared to approximately 62% of English speakers in the province as a whole. So that's almost 10%, 10 percentage points higher. And now we'll look at minimum secondary education attainment. So this is the proportion of individuals who have at least completed high school. So these rates tend to be quite high among English speakers in Quebec as a whole. 85.5% of English speakers have attained a minimum secondary level of education. In Capitale-Nationale, it's even higher at 90.7%. And this remains quite high throughout. This is a little bit higher than the rates that we see for, this is bilingualism, apologies, the rates that we see for French speakers. So the minimum secondary educational attainment rates for French speakers in blue hovers around 86, 87% in the region. And then finally, our bilingualism data. So this shows in red the bilingualism rates of English speakers. So what English speakers in the census reported that they were bilingual. And I'll just flag that in the census, the way that's measured is whether individuals are comfortable or able to conduct a conversation in the other official language. So in this case, for French, and for French speakers, that would be in English. So we do see higher rates of bilingualism among English speakers, although this definition is quite open-ended. So individuals who are fully bilingual would perhaps be captured in this, as well as individuals who have conversational levels of French, who are comfortable ordering coffee in French, but might have a bit more difficulty, say, conducting an interview in French. But across the board, we see significantly higher rates of bilingualism among English speakers as compared to French speakers. And I'll also flag that Capitale-Nationale has one of the highest rates of bilingualism in the province. So 84.6% of the English-speaking population in the region are bilingual. So now I'll talk about issues and needs. These are kind of the underlying themes that we see coming out in the research, or things that might contribute to some of the disparities that we see in the quantitative data. And these are identified primarily through our meetings and focus groups with different community stakeholders in the region. So a primary area of focus is language, and this is echoed across the province. So we see sometimes a lack of French language proficiency among English speakers in spite of high reported rates of bilingualism. That also can look like a lack of French language confidence in these kind of internal barriers, as well as a lack of French language training programs, which help to address some of these issues or areas where individuals might like to improve their French. In terms of training and education, we see that there are really high rates of education in the region. However, there are not significant options for English language education. Of course, we do have Champlain in the region, and some programs at Laval might be offered in English, and some vocational education. There is vocational training center in Capitale-Nationale. But if individuals are interested in other educational options, they have to often leave the region or perhaps the province altogether in order to pursue those. And there's a lack of programs that are preparing individuals who are leaving English language programs to integrate into the workforce. So we call those bridging programs. And then finally, kind of on that note, there's an issue with integration into workforce and skills mismatch. So we see this among immigrants in particular, people coming with foreign credentials who often have difficulty getting their qualifications recognized, as well as issues accessing employment services and wraparound support in English. And from this follows our recommendations. So these are general recommendations that are best implemented through strong community partnerships and collaborations in order to ensure that the recommendations that we're offering are tailored to the needs of the community who they would be targeting. So these include targeted or tailored work integrated French language training and skills training program. And this includes particularly professional French. So people often report needing support in their written French language competencies in particular, adapting or expanding public employment programs and services to reach English speakers and to ensure that those are accessible in English, improving access to English language vocational training programs and post-secondary education within the region to address issues of brain drain, and strengthening partnerships with local organizations serving English speakers to tackle issues related to outmigration. And this touches on education as well. So I'm going to end there. I'll stop sharing my screen. We're going to leave the breakout room in about 30 seconds. We'll be politely kicked out and we'll return to the full room for any further questions that individuals have. But I hope you enjoyed.